Hidden within the ancient depths of our planet's oceans lies a secret about the true nature of giants, a revelation that will challenge everything you thought you knew about prehistoric life. Imagine entering the prehistoric ocean, not to see tiny trilobites or primitive fish, but to come face to face with truly colossal creatures. Tentacled apex predators, longer than modern giant squids, drift past. Turtles weighing over 1,800 kilograms cruise by, and even what we consider normal fish were anything but. This is the world of prehistoric marine gigantism, a phenomenon many are unaware of, stretching back hundreds of millions of years. Unlike deep-sea gigantism, this prehistoric version encompassed every part of the ocean, from reefs to shallow waters. Remarkably, these giants often evolved in completely different eras for distinct reasons, never coexisting, yet all reaching immense proportions. Why did giants continuously emerge throughout almost all eras of prehistoric oceans? And which descendants of these colossal beings are still alive today? To understand what might be the oldest form of gigantism, we first have to examine one of its most peculiar examples, Endoceras, the largest of the orthocones. You might be thinking that this creature couldn't possibly have existed, given its resemblance to an enormous, pointy dunce cap. Endoceras weren't squids, but they were cephalopods, hence their tentacles. Yet, believe it or not, these things were apex predators during the Ordovician period, which seems strange considering their awkward appearance. Of course, their reign as apex predators was solely due to their sheer gigantic size. Most experts agree that the longest Endoceras reached about 6 meters in length, with the majority of that being its massive, pointed shell. Some estimates suggest even larger orthocones, like Camaraoceras, exceeded 10 meters. But these figures are not widely supported today, with most believing the maximum size was closer to 7 meters. It's challenging to be precise, as we can only infer their true length from fossils millions of years old. But what everyone agrees on is that these creatures were enormous. Compare them to modern giant squids. Without their ridiculously long, trailing tentacles, the main body of a giant squid only reaches around 4-5 meters. Endoceras' hard shell wasn't just squishy tentacles adding to its length. It was substantial animal mass. So, who would win in a fight? Keep in mind, these creatures evolved in entirely different time periods, with giant squids appearing only about 5 million years ago, while Endoceras lived 470 million years ago. But for the sake of a hypothetical battle, let's consider it. Endoceras possessed a massive shell that a giant squid would likely be unable to penetrate. They were also incredibly heavy, probably close to 317 kilograms. However, if you're imagining an Endoceras hurtling through the water at 160 kilometers per hour like a harpoon, straight through a giant squid, that's probably not how they operated. Their shell was primarily for protection and buoyancy control, not as a super epic living javelin. Even if a giant squid couldn't break the shell, once it reached the softer parts, the fight would become much more even, with each cephalopod clashing beak to beak. But Endoceras wasn't known for its agility, especially with that colossal shell. It would need to somehow grab the giant squid to inflict damage. Given that giant squids are among the most intelligent invertebrates, they would likely be able to evade a direct grasp from Endoceras. Unless Endoceras possessed an extraordinarily greater amount of muscle than we currently believe, it would likely lose. Even if it were much stronger, the giant squid would probably still escape such a clumsy opponent. Yet, this very clumsiness was the reason Endoceras grew so large in the first place. In the Ordovician oceans, nothing else was fast either. There were no sharks, no marine reptiles, no lightning-quick predators zipping through the water. and certainly no giant squids. Everything was slow, simple, and frankly, somewhat awkward. In an ecosystem full of sluggish early animals, size alone was enough to make you untouchable. You didn't need speed or agility, you just needed to be too big for anything else to challenge. Its giant shell helped protect it from smaller fish nibbling at its soft head. But its greatest defense was against other orthocones. As the apex predators of their time, their only real competition was each other, all drifting around trying to consume one another. An evolutionary arms race, confined literally to their own kind, pushed them to grow larger and larger. With Ordovician seas teeming with easily accessible food, there was no shortage of sustenance. Unfortunately, its rather peculiar shell proved to be its undoing. When other life forms, like early sharks, began to grow larger, this giant shell suddenly became a disadvantage, making them predictable targets. A body that looks this awkward is, in fact, just awkward. There's no way around it. While they were apex predators of their era, their design simply couldn't compete when hyper-agile sharks and other swift animals started to appear. You might be thinking, okay, but apex predators are always big. But here's the crucial difference. Land predators barely existed yet. Nothing substantial was walking around eating things. There were no dinosaurs, no giant terrestrial reptiles, not even early land vertebrates to compete with. The ocean was the entire stage, and every major predator on Earth lived within it. On top of that, the ocean provides giants with a huge advantage for gigantism. Gravity barely affects them underwater since buoyancy supports most of their weight, meaning marine animals can grow to sizes that would be physically impossible on land without their bodies collapsing. So, as these swimming orthocones began to fade out, something else had to claim the top spot in the ocean. These were the Eurypterids, also known as the biggest scorpions that ever existed. Following the marine gigantism effect, they were absolutely enormous compared to modern scorpions. The largest of them, Gigantism, could grow over 4 meters long, which is certainly bigger than you. But why did these creatures also get so big? You might attribute it to high oxygen levels, but that didn't truly become a factor until the Carboniferous, millions of years after Eurypterids were already reaching giant sizes. Their gigantism wasn't about oxygen at all. It was also about an arms race. Once the old orthocone predators started to decline, the entire ecosystem essentially became a free-for-all. Eurypterids suddenly found themselves competing with other Eurypterids, early fish, and a range of newly evolving prey species. When everything around you is getting tougher, faster, and more dangerous, the only way to stay on top is to scale up. Bigger bodies meant more strength, more reach, more power behind their claws, and a massive advantage in shallow seas where half the ecosystem was trying to eat the other half. By the time the Devonian period arrived, the oceans were filled with heavily armored fish called placoderms. Everything was evolving thicker plates, harder jaws, and better defenses. When everyone around you keeps upgrading their armor, the only way to stay ahead is to upgrade your weapons and your size. This is how Dunkleosteus came to be. It was essentially the final boss of this entire arms race era. The biggest estimates place it around 6 to 9 meters long, with a head that was practically a block of armor plating. Fish developed armor, then fish developed stronger jaws to crush that armor, and in turn, fish developed more armor, and the cycle continued until it produced Dunkleosteus. Dunkleosteus fossils have been found, with bite marks from other Dunkleosteus jaws, further evidence of these apex predators preying on each other. Most arms races were just animals against their own kind, forcing them to evolve bigger and bigger until their bodies couldn't practically be any larger. If you've been paying attention, You'll notice this is a common pattern we keep seeing throughout prehistoric eras. The apex predators become apex by simply growing larger and larger until they are giant versions of themselves, and then their only competition is each other. First, the oceans created giant orthocones. Then, it made giant scorpions. Then, it made giant armored fish. Essentially, almost any body plan could become an apex predator for its time period. They just needed to be the first ones to evolve into giants. Now, fast forward hundreds of millions of years. By the late Cretaceous, the top predators weren't strange orthocones or plated tanks anymore. Instead, they were reptiles. The Cretaceous oceans were enormous and shallow worldwide. Warm water, high sea levels, and massive reef systems created some of the most productive marine ecosystems ever. With that much life in the water, predators could grow absurdly large because there was always something giant to eat. As the ocean filled with more giants, the only way to compete was to also be a giant. All the colossal marine reptiles you've heard of, Mosasaurs, Pliosaurs like Kronosaurus, were thriving, pushing the size race to grow even bigger. And again, this isn't like polar gigantism. Oxygen levels weren't even that much higher than they are now. You simply had to be big to compete. This is exactly what happened to the ancient turtle. This is Archelon, the largest sea turtle to ever exist. Archelon was over 4 meters long, with a shell wider than most cars and flippers built for crossing entire oceans. It wasn't big because of oxygen or temperatures. It was big because the Cretaceous ocean was a battleground of monsters, and you had to be a monster to survive. But here's the big question. If these giant body plans were so successful, why did they all die out? Where are the giants today? Well, the most obvious cause was extinction. When you get absolutely obliterated by a giant asteroid, it wipes and resets the entire playing field. Even if mosasaurs were strong, they would have to re-evolve after being wiped out. Today's world is only 66 million years old, compared to the 150 million years that the Mesozoic lasted. This time, mammals took over. In the modern era, with colder oceans and fewer massive abundances of food, it's not as easy for these enormous reptiles to survive. But let's assume the climate was the same, and you spawned a bunch of mosasaurs into today's oceans. Would they start dominating the oceans once again as top apex predators? Not really. And it isn't just because of food. Reptilian gigantism has basically ceased to exist. There are several reasons for that. First, modern oceans are dominated by warm-blooded hunters like orcas, sperm whales, and fast-moving sharks. These animals can chase, sprint, and outmaneuver almost anything. Second, most ecosystems simply don't support that scale anymore. Prehistoric reptiles got huge because there were giant prey items everywhere. Giant ammonites, giant turtles, giant fish, giant everything. Once that all vanished, the entire reptile superpredator blueprint went extinct with it. Reptiles simply don't fill that role today, and evolution hasn't pushed them in that direction for tens of millions of years. Third, today's food webs are tighter and leaner. Being a 12 to 1.5 meter reptile means burning massive amounts of energy. Unlike whales, reptiles can't use thick blubber, warm blood, or incredibly efficient oxygen use to thrive in cold water or during long migrations. You could also include a fourth reason. There's no chance humans would let mosasaurs suddenly start running rampant, but let's exclude us from this hypothetical. But as you might know, marine gigantism didn't fully disappear. It's just not the same as it was in prehistoric times. Some descendants of these giants are still with us, hiding in plain sight. The leatherback sea turtle might not be as heavy as Archelon, but it still reaches over 900 kilograms. The giant squid still grows over 12 meters, And the blue whale is still the largest animal to ever live on Earth, bigger than anything the prehistoric oceans ever produced. The giants today are just different and are much more niche compared to the giants of the past. We don't see giant lizards or giant scorpions anymore, but the arms race never fully ended. Giant squids evolved to grow longer and stronger to compete with other predators. Sperm whales evolved into the largest predator on the planet, designed to chase those same massive squids. We still see these same patterns play out today, but with different animals than previous ecosystems. But if another extinction-level event happens, who knows? We could see giant dolphins next.